The November wind cut through Chicago's downtown streets like a knife through silk, carrying with it the scent of early winter and distant lake water. Grace Miller pulled her thin coat tighter around her shoulders as she hurried down Michigan Avenue, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. The city lights reflected off the wet pavement from an earlier rain, creating a kaleidoscope of gold and silver that would have been beautiful if she wasn't running late. Again, her phone buzzed in her pocket. Another text from her manager, Richard. She didn't need to look at it to know what it said. The Sterling Room didn't tolerate tardiness, not even from their hardest-working waitress. Grace picked up her pace, her sensible work shoes splashing through shallow puddles as she navigated the evening crowd of well-dressed professionals heading home while she was just beginning her shift. At 25, Grace had become an expert at running. Running between classes at community college in the morning, running to her afternoon shift at the diner on State Street, and running to her evening position at the Sterling Room, where the tips were good enough to almost make the exhaustion worth it. Her grandmother had always told her that hard work built character. Grace was pretty sure she had enough character by now to last a lifetime. The restaurant's entrance appeared before her, all polished brass and gleaming glass. Through the windows, she could see the warm amber lighting that made everything inside look like a painting from another era. The Sterling Room catered to a specific clientele, the kind of people who thought nothing of spending Grace's monthly rent on a single dinner. She had learned not to judge. These people paid her bills, funded her education, and occasionally reminded her that kindness wasn't always tied to wealth, though the correlation was inconsistent at best. Grace slipped through the employee entrance, immediately enveloped by the warmth and the complex aroma of Chef Antoine's kitchen: garlic, fresh herbs, butter, and something sweet she couldn't quite identify. The back hallway was a stark contrast to the elegant dining room, all practical tile and stainless steel, the real machinery behind the beautiful facade. "You're 7 minutes late," Richard said, appearing from the office like he'd been waiting. He was a thin man in his 50s with wire-rimmed glasses that he constantly adjusted. Despite his stern demeanor, Grace knew he had a soft spot for her. He'd given her this job when she desperately needed it, after all. "I know, I'm sorry. The bus was delayed and then—" Richard held up a hand. "Just clock in and get to your section. We have a full house tonight, and the Johnsons specifically requested you." Grace felt a small surge of relief. The Johnsons were regulars, a sweet elderly couple who always left generous tips and asked about her classes. She quickly changed into her uniform, a crisp white shirt, black slacks, and the restaurant's signature burgundy vest, and tied her dark blonde hair back into a neat bun. A quick check in the mirror showed tired blue eyes and the kind of exhaustion that no amount of concealer could hide, but her smile was genuine when she practiced it. That was the important part. The dining room was already humming with quiet conversation and the gentle clink of silverware on china. Grace moved through the space with practiced efficiency, greeting the Johnsons and taking their drink order, checking on her other tables, her mind slipping into the comfortable rhythm of work. This was familiar territory. Here, she knew exactly what was expected of her. The evening progressed smoothly until Richard approached her near the kitchen, his expression slightly tense. "Grace, I need you to take table 12. She glanced toward the corner of the restaurant where table 12 sat, the most private table in the establishment, partially secluded by an ornate wooden screen and positioned to offer a view of the entire dining room while remaining somewhat separate from it. It was the table they reserved for their most important guests, the ones who valued discretion as much as quality. "Is everything okay?" Grace asked, noticing two men in dark suits standing near the table, their posture too alert to be regular diners. "Everything's fine. Just be professional, more so than usual." Richard adjusted his glasses nervously. "Mr. Hale is a very important client." Grace had heard the name before, whispered among the staff with a mixture of respect and wariness. Jonathan Hale. She didn't know much about him except that he owned several businesses throughout Chicago, commanded a level of respect that went beyond mere wealth, and apparently valued his privacy enough to have what looked like security personnel dining with him. As she approached table 12, Grace took in the scene with the quick assessment that came from years of waitressing. Two men in suits sat at attention, their eyes constantly scanning the room. And then there was him. Jonathan Hale was not what she expected. Media photos, the few she'd glimpsed in business sections of newspapers, didn't capture the intensity of his presence. He appeared to be in his early 40s, with dark hair that showed distinguished traces of gray at the temples and features that were striking rather than conventionally handsome. But it was his eyes that caught her attention. dark, intelligent, carrying a weight that suggested he'd seen more of life than most people would in 2 lifetimes, and in his arms, looking tiny against his dark suit, was a little girl. Grace felt something shift in her chest. The child couldn't have been more than 2 years old, with soft dark curls that framed a cherubic face. She was dressed in a beautiful burgundy dress that matched the restaurant's color scheme, as if someone had carefully coordinated her outfit. But what struck Grace most was the child's expression, solemn, quiet, watching everything with eyes too old for such a young face. "Good evening," Grace said, her professional smile in place as she approached the table. "Welcome to the Sterling Room. My name is Grace, and I'll be taking care of you tonight." Jonathan Hale looked up at her, and Grace felt the full force of his attention. It wasn't threatening exactly, but it was intense, the gaze of someone who noticed everything and forgot nothing. "Good evening," he replied. His voice was deep, cultured, with the kind of confidence that came from never being questioned. "We'll start with sparkling water. And do you have apple juice for children?" "Of course. I'll bring that right away." Grace pulled out her notepad, but her attention kept drifting to the little girl, who was now watching her with open curiosity. "What's her name?" There was a pause, brief but noticeable, before Jonathan answered. "Lily. That's beautiful." Grace smiled at the child, a genuine warmth replacing her professional mask. "Hi, Lily." The little girl blinked at her, and Grace could have sworn she saw something like recognition flicker across those tiny features, but that was impossible. She'd never seen this child before. "I'll be right back with your drinks," Grace said, retreating to give them time with the menus. In the kitchen, she found herself thinking about the little girl. There was something heartbreaking about how quiet she was, how she sat so still in her father's arms. Grace had worked enough family dinners to know that most 2-year-olds were bundles of chaotic energy, not solemn little observers. She prepared a tray with sparkling water in crystal glasses and apple juice in a special child's cup with a lid, adding a small bowl of fresh berries that Chef Antoine had prepared for another table. Kids liked berries. Maybe it would make the little one smile. When Grace returned to table 12, Jonathan was speaking quietly on his phone while Lily sat in a high chair that the staff had quickly provided. The child's eyes immediately locked onto Grace as she approached. "Here we are," Grace said cheerfully, setting down the drinks. She placed the berries in front of Lily. "And I brought you something special. Do you like strawberries?" Lily stared at the berries, then up at Grace. Her small hand reached out, not for the fruit but toward Grace herself. Jonathan ended his call and noticed. "Lily, use your manners," he said gently, though there was surprise in his voice. "I apologize. She's usually quite shy with strangers." "It's no problem at all," Grace assured him, charmed by the little hand still extended toward her. "Some kids are just naturally friendly." She took the menus and ran through the specials, noting Jonathan's selections with half her attention while the other half remained fixed on Lily, who hadn't stopped watching her. There was something in the child's gaze that Grace couldn't quite name, a kind of searching, as if she was looking for something she recognized. Throughout the evening, Grace found herself drawn back to table 12 more often than strictly necessary. She checked on their meals, refilled water glasses, brought more berries when Lily finished the first bowl. Each time, the little girl's face would light up in a way it didn't seem to for anyone else, not even her father. Jonathan Hale noticed. Grace could feel his attention on her whenever she approached, that assessing gaze that made her wonder what he saw. She was acutely aware that she was just a waitress in a borrowed uniform, probably looking as tired as she felt. Serving a man who inhabited a world so far removed from her own, they might as well have been on different planets. The dining room had settled into the comfortable lull of late evening when Grace approached their table again. Jonathan was cutting a piece of his ribeye into tiny portions for Lily, who was making a valiant effort to feed herself with a fork comically large for her small hands. "How is everything?" Grace asked. "Excellent, as always," Jonathan replied. There was something different in his tone now, less formal. "Lily seems quite taken with you." Grace felt her cheeks warm. "She's a sweetheart. You're very lucky." Something flickered across Jonathan's face, pain, maybe, or regret. But it was gone so quickly Grace wondered if she'd imagined it. "Yes, I am." Lily chose that moment to drop her fork, which clattered against the plate. She looked down at it, then up at Grace with wide eyes that seemed on the verge of tears. "Oh, it's okay, sweetie," Grace said quickly, crouching down to be at eye level with the child. She retrieved the fork and produced a clean one from her apron pocket. Waitress Preparedness 101. "See? All better. Everyone drops things sometimes." Lily's small face broke into a smile, the first real smile Grace had seen from her all evening. It transformed her completely, making her look exactly like the happy 2-year-old she should be. And then Lily reached out both hands toward Grace, making the universal gesture of a child who wanted to be picked up. Before Grace could react or explain that she couldn't, Jonathan spoke. "Lily, no. Grace is working, you need to stay in your chair." But Lily was insistent, her small hands opening and closing, reaching for Grace with a determination that was both adorable and somehow desperate. Grace looked at Jonathan, silently asking permission, and saw him nod slightly, though his expression was complex. Confused, wary, but also curious. Grace picked up the little girl, who immediately wrapped her arms around Grace's neck and buried her face in her shoulder. Grace felt the small body relax against hers, felt the trust in that embrace, and something inside her chest cracked open. She'd never had much experience with children. Her life was too hectic, too focused on survival. But holding Lily felt natural in a way she couldn't explain. "I'm sorry," Jonathan said, and he actually sounded apologetic. "She's never done this before. Not with anyone." "It's okay," Grace murmured, gently rubbing Lily's back. "Really, it's fine." She could feel the entire restaurant watching them, including Richard, who was probably calculating how much trouble she'd be in for this deviation from protocol. But she couldn't bring herself to put Lily down, not when the child was holding on like Grace was her lifeline. And then Lily lifted her head, looked directly at Grace with those solemn, searching eyes, and spoke for the first time that evening. "Mama." The word was clear, unmistakable, carrying through the quiet restaurant like a bell. Grace froze. The conversations at nearby tables stopped. She felt Jonathan go absolutely still beside them. "What?" Grace whispered, sure she'd misheard. But Lily said it again, louder this time, her small hand touching Grace's face with infinite gentleness. "Mama." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Grace looked at Jonathan, saw shock written across his features, saw his security personnel standing up, alert and tense. She saw Richard approaching with concern on his face, saw other diners turning to stare. I don't," Grace stammered, her heart hammering. "I've never met her before. I don't know why she would." Jonathan stood up smoothly, his composure returning like a mask sliding back into place. "Give her to me," he said quietly. Grace tried to hand Lily over, but the little girl wouldn't let go. She clung to Grace, and when Jonathan attempted to take her, she began to cry. Not a tantrum, but heartbroken sobs that made Grace's chest ache. "Mama, no, Mama, stay." "Lily, sweetheart, I'm not." Grace's voice caught. She didn't know what to say, how to explain to a 2-year-old that she was mistaken, that Grace was nobody, just a waitress who happened to serve their table. Jonathan's face was unreadable, but his voice remained gentle. "Lily, baby, we need to let Grace work. She has other customers." Richard appeared at Grace's elbow, his expression torn between concern and disapproval. "Grace, perhaps you should—" "It's fine," Jonathan interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "We're nearly finished anyway." He looked at Grace, and she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. Not anger, but a piercing curiosity mixed with something that might have been pain. "Would you mind holding her for just a few more minutes, until I can settle the bill?" Grace nodded, unable to speak, and carried Lily back toward her high chair. She sat down in Jonathan's vacated seat, keeping the little girl in her lap, who had stopped crying but still clung to her with fierce determination. "Lily," Grace said softly, "I think you might have me confused with someone else, sweetheart." But Lily just burrowed closer and whispered again, "Mama." Grace looked up to find Jonathan watching them with an expression so complex she couldn't begin to decipher it. His security personnel were alert but hadn't moved, clearly waiting for his signal. Around them, the restaurant had returned to its normal hum, but Grace could feel the weight of surreptitious glances. When Jonathan finally managed to coax Lily back into his arms, a process that involved promises of ice cream and a new storybook, the little girl's face was streaked with tears. She kept reaching back toward Grace, calling for her mama over and over, breaking Grace's heart with every repetition. Jonathan pulled out his wallet, but before he could extract his credit card, Grace found her voice. "Mr. Hale, I need you to understand. I have no idea why she called me that. I've never seen your daughter before tonight. I would never—" "I know," he said simply, and the certainty in his voice stopped her protest. "I had you researched the moment you introduced yourself." Grace's blood ran cold. "You what?" "Standard precaution. I'm a careful man, Ms. Miller." Grace Elizabeth Miller, 25 years old, community college student studying social work, raised by your grandmother after your parents passed when you were 7, currently working 3 jobs to pay for school and living expenses. No criminal record, no concerning associations, no connection to anyone in my world. He paused, his dark eyes holding hers, which makes my daughter's reaction to you all the more interesting. Grace didn't know whether to be terrified or angry. You had no right. I have every right to protect my daughter, Jonathan said, his voice soft but carrying an edge of steel. But you're correct that you had no involvement in this. Whatever Lily sees in you, it's not based on any prior meeting. He placed several $100 bills on the table, far more than the meal cost. For your trouble, and for your discretion. He moved to leave, Lily still reaching back over his shoulder, still calling tearfully for Grace. But at the last moment, Jonathan turned back. Ms. Miller, I'd like to ask you something. Grace nodded, not trusting her voice. My daughter has been struggling. She's been behind on developmental milestones. Her pediatrician has been concerned. He paused, and Grace saw vulnerability flash across his face before he locked it down. That was the first word she's ever spoken. Grace's hand flew to her mouth. Oh my God. Indeed. Jonathan reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card, extending it to her. If you would be willing, I'd like to bring Lily back here to see if this was a one-time occurrence or if there's something about you that helps her feel safe enough to communicate. Grace took the card with trembling fingers. It was simple, elegant, with just a name and a phone number. Mr. Hale, I'm just a waitress. I'm not a therapist or a specialist or you're someone my daughter called Mama, he said simply. In my experience, children often see things in people that adults miss. He adjusted Lily in his arms, the gesture so tender it made Grace's throat tight. I'm not asking for anything inappropriate, Ms. Miller. Just permission to bring my daughter back to see you. On your terms, during your working hours. Completely professional. Grace looked at Lily, who had quieted in her father's arms but was still watching Grace with those heartbreaking eyes. She thought about what Jonathan had said, that this was Lily's first word. She thought about how the little girl had reached for her with such trust, such certainty. Okay, Grace heard herself say. Yes, of course. Something in Jonathan's expression softened. Thank you. I'll be in touch. He nodded to his security personnel, who moved to flank him as he headed toward the exit. Grace watched them go, watched Lily looking back at her until they disappeared through the restaurant's brass doors into the cold Chicago night. She stood there for a long moment holding Jonathan Hale's business card, her mind reeling. Around her, the restaurant continued its evening rhythm, but Grace felt like she'd stepped into a different story entirely, one she didn't understand but couldn't step away from. Richard appeared at her side. Grace, what on earth just happened? I have absolutely no idea, she whispered. Later, after her shift ended and she was walking to the bus stop through the freezing November night, Grace pulled out the card again. The number seemed to glow in the streetlight, a portal to a world she had no business entering. But she couldn't stop thinking about Lily's face, about the trust in those small arms wrapping around her neck, about a little girl who had chosen her first word so carefully and directed it at a complete stranger. Mama. Grace tucked the card carefully into her wallet. She had a feeling her ordinary life had just become considerably more complicated. What she didn't see was the black car parked down the street, or Jonathan Hale sitting in the back seat watching her walk away while Lily slept peacefully in her car seat beside him, more peaceful than she'd been in months. Take us home, Marcus, Jonathan said to his driver, but his eyes remained on Grace until she turned the corner and disappeared from view. In his pocket, his phone buzzed with a message from his head of security. Background check complete. She's exactly what she appears to be. Nobody important. Jonathan looked at his sleeping daughter, at the small smile on her face that he hadn't seen in so long he'd almost forgotten what it looked like. Nobody important, he thought, but that couldn't be right. Because somehow this waitress with tired eyes and a genuine smile had done something that dozens of specialists and therapists couldn't do. She'd made his daughter speak. And more than that, she'd made Lily feel safe enough to reach for something she'd lost. Whatever this was, whoever Grace Miller truly was, Jonathan was going to find out. Because his daughter's well-being was worth any risk, any complication, any consequence, even if it meant letting someone into their carefully guarded world, even if it meant admitting that maybe, just maybe, they needed someone like Grace Miller more than he'd ever imagined possible. The car pulled away from the curb, carrying them back to their penthouse fortress, But Jonathan found himself already planning his return to the Sterling room. His investigation into Grace Miller had just begun, and something told him that what he'd find would change everything. Behind them, unnoticed by either party, another car started its engine and followed at a discreet distance, its occupant making notes on a phone, taking photographs, reporting to someone who had very different reasons for being interested in Jonathan Hale's unexpected dinner companion. In Chicago's underworld of business and influence, nothing happened in isolation, and Jonathan Hale having a personal interest in anyone, especially someone as seemingly ordinary as a waitress, was information worth noting, worth investigating, worth exploiting. But for now, Grace Miller walked home in blissful ignorance, carrying with her the memory of a little girl's embrace and the echo of a word that shouldn't have been hers to hear, Mama. It would haunt her dreams that night, along with the image of dark, intelligent eyes that had seen too much but somehow still held hope. Chapter 1 had ended, but their story was only beginning. Grace stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror of her tiny studio apartment, wondering if she'd imagined the entire evening. 3 days had passed since Lily Hale had called her Mama, and Grace still couldn't shake the memory of those small arms wrapped around her neck, that absolute trust in a child's embrace. The business card sat on her nightstand, where she'd placed it after getting home that night. She hadn't called the number. What would she even say? The November morning was gray and cold, typical for Chicago as it crept toward winter. Grace wrapped her hands around her coffee mug, her one luxury, good coffee beans she splurged on once a month, and watched the steam rise in delicate spirals. She had classes in an hour, then a shift at the diner, then back to the Sterling room for the evening. Same routine, different day, except it wasn't the same anymore. Something had shifted that night, though Grace couldn't quite articulate what. Her phone buzzed on the counter. A text from her roommate and best friend, Sarah, who worked night shifts as a nurse and was probably just getting home. You okay? You've been weird since Saturday. Spill. Grace smiled despite herself. Sarah had an uncanny ability to read her, even through text messages. They'd met in community college 3 years ago and had been inseparable since, two young women trying to build futures from nothing but determination and student loans. Long story. Tell you tonight? You better. And it better involve that mysterious hot guy the other waitresses won't stop talking about. Grace felt heat creep up her neck. Of course, the Sterling room gossip mill had been working overtime. The story had probably grown to epic proportions by now. The quiet billionaire, his daughter, the dramatic moment in the dining room. She'd fielded questions from co-workers all through her last 2 shifts, deflecting with practiced skill. She finished her coffee, grabbed her backpack, and headed out into the cold morning. The bus ride to campus was crowded, filled with the smell of wet wool and coffee and too many people pressed together. Grace found a spot by the window and pulled out her social work textbook, trying to focus on the chapter about childhood development and trauma. The irony wasn't lost on her. Professor Chen's lecture on attachment theory felt surreal given recent events. Grace found herself paying closer attention than usual, her mind connecting academic concepts to a little girl with dark curls and eyes that had searched her face like she was looking for something lost. Attachment isn't just about biology, Professor Chen was saying, walking between the rows of seats with her characteristic energy. Children form bonds based on safety, consistency, and emotional availability. Sometimes those bonds form quickly, even instantaneously, when a child recognizes in someone the qualities they desperately need. A student raised her hand. But what about cases where children attach to strangers? Is that a red flag for something wrong at home? Professor Chen paused, considering. Not necessarily. It could indicate that the child is seeking something they're not getting, yes. But it could also be a sign of a naturally open temperament, or recognition of genuine warmth and safety in another person. Children are remarkably intuitive about who will care for them. Grace wrote this down, her hand moving almost of its own accord. She thought about Jonathan Hale's words that Lily had been behind on developmental milestones, that Mama had been her first word. What did it mean that the child had saved that word for a stranger? After class, Grace walked across campus to the library, where she had a 2-hour gap before her diner shift. Instead of studying, she found herself at a computer terminal, her fingers hovering over the keyboard before she typed, Jonathan Hale, Chicago. The search results were extensive but carefully curated. Jonathan Hale, CEO of Hale Enterprises, a diversified company with interests in real estate, technology, and various other ventures. There were photos from charity galas, business conferences, groundbreaking ceremonies. In each one, He looked impeccable. Suits that probably cost more than Grace's monthly rent, surrounded by Chicago's elite. But there were no personal details. No mention of a wife or family. No social media presence. Whatever Jonathan Hale's private life looked like, he kept it fiercely guarded. Grace was about to close the browser when a headline from 2 years ago caught her eye. Hale Enterprises CEO takes leave following personal tragedy. She clicked on it, her heart rate picking up. The article was brief, respectful, mentioning only that Jonathan Hale had stepped back from day-to-day operations temporarily due to a personal family matter. No details, no speculation, just a statement from the company's board expressing their support. 2 years ago, around the time Lily would have been born, Grace closed the browser, feeling like she'd intruded on something deeply private. Whatever had happened to Jonathan Hale and his family, it wasn't her business. She was just a waitress who'd had a strange encounter with his daughter. That was all. So why couldn't she stop thinking about them? The diner shift passed in its usual blur of orders and coffee refills. Grace had worked at Rosie's Diner for 3 years, and it was as familiar to her as her own apartment. The cracked red vinyl booths, the perpetually sticky floor, the smell of bacon grease that never quite went away. It wasn't glamorous, but the tips were decent, and the owners, an older couple named Frank and Rosie, treated her like family. "You're distracted today," Rosie observed during a rare slow moment, her kind eyes missing nothing. She was a woman in her 60s, built solid from years of diner work, with gray hair always pulled back in a practical bun. "Just tired," Grace said, which wasn't entirely untrue. Rosie didn't look convinced. "You work too hard, sweetheart. When's the last time you did something just for fun?" Grace laughed. "Fun? What's that?" "Exactly my point." Rosie patted her hand. "You're 25 years old. You should be out with friends, maybe dating, living your life, not working yourself into the ground." "I'm building a future," Grace said, repeating the mantra she'd told herself countless times. "Once I finish school, get my degree, find a good job, then I can slow down." "And what if life doesn't wait for you to be ready?" Rosie asked gently. "What if something wonderful comes along right now, but you're too busy to notice?" Before Grace could respond, the bell above the door chimed, announcing a new customer. She turned automatically, her waitress smile already in place, and froze. Jonathan Hale stood in the doorway of Rosie's Diner, looking completely out of place in his expensive coat and tailored suit. And in his arms, wrapped in a pink winter jacket, was Lily. The little girl's face lit up the moment she saw Grace. "Mama!" Every head in the diner turned. Grace felt her face flush as she stood there, uncertain what to do. Jonathan approached her table, his expression calm but with something cautious in his eyes. "Ms. Miller," he said formally, "I apologize for showing up at your workplace unannounced. I hope you don't mind." Grace glanced at Rosie, who was watching the scene with undisguised interest, then back at Jonathan. "How did you know I'd be here? You mentioned working 3 jobs. It wasn't difficult to determine your schedule." He paused. "Again, I apologize if this is intrusive, but Lily has been persistent." As if to emphasize his point, Lily began reaching for Grace, her small hands opening and closing in that universal gesture. "Mama, up. Mama, please." Grace's heart melted. She looked at Jonathan questioningly, and he nodded. Grace took the little girl, who immediately wrapped her arms around Grace's neck and sighed with contentment. "Well," Rosie said, appearing at Grace's elbow with remarkable speed, "aren't you going to introduce us to your friends? Rosie, this is Mr. Hale and his daughter Lily. They were customers at the Sterling Room a few nights ago." Grace stumbled over the explanation, aware of how inadequate it sounded. "I see." Rosie's sharp eyes moved between Grace, Jonathan, and Lily, taking in the scene with the assessment of someone who'd seen a lot in her years behind the diner counter. "Well, Mr. Hale, since you're here, might as well sit down. Grace, take your break. I'll cover your tables. Rosie, I don't think— break. Now." Rosie's tone brooked no argument. She turned to Jonathan with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Coffee? Please. Black." Grace found herself sliding into a booth with Lily still in her arms, while Jonathan sat across from them. The situation felt surreal. This wealthy, powerful man in her worn diner booth while his daughter cuddled against her like they'd known each other forever. "I owe you an explanation," Jonathan said once Rosie had delivered his coffee and bustled away, though Grace noticed her hovering nearby protectively. "You really don't," Grace said. "I'm just confused why you're here." Jonathan took a sip of his coffee, and Grace saw him trying to hide his surprise at finding it actually quite good. Since Saturday night, Lily hasn't stopped talking. Not just saying mama, but other words. Short sentences. She's trying to communicate more than she has in months. Grace looked down at the little girl who was playing with the button on Grace's uniform shirt with intense concentration. That's wonderful. Her pediatrician says it's remarkable, unprecedented given her previous struggles. Jonathan's dark eyes fixed on Grace. The only thing that changed was meeting you. But that doesn't make sense. I didn't do anything special. You were kind to her. Jonathan interrupted. You saw her. Really saw her. Not as a problem to be fixed or a patient to be diagnosed, but as a person. He paused. That seems to be more rare than it should be. Grace felt something twist in her chest. Mr. Hale. Jonathan. Please. Jonathan, she corrected, the name feeling strange on her tongue. I'm happy that Lily's doing better truly, but I'm not sure what you want from me. I'd like to pay you for your time, he said simply. To spend time with Lily. Not as therapy, nothing formal, just being around her, letting her feel whatever it is she feels when she's near you. Grace stared at him. You want to pay me to hang out with your daughter? Is that so strange? Yes, Grace laughed, though without humor. I'm a waitress and a student. I'm nobody special. There are actual professionals who could. I've hired actual professionals, Jonathan said, his voice tightening slightly. Speech therapists, child psychologists, developmental specialists. Some of them helped, marginally. None of them made her light up the way she does with you. He gestured to Lily, who had indeed relaxed completely in Grace's arms, playing contentedly with the sugar packets from the table caddy. Look at her. When's the last time you saw a child that comfortable with a stranger? Grace had to admit he had a point. Lily was acting like she'd known Grace her entire life, completely at ease in a way that did seem unusual for a toddler with a stranger. I don't know if I can accept money for this, Grace said slowly. It feels wrong somehow. Then don't think of it as payment. Think of it as compensation for your time. Time you'd otherwise spend working one of your 3 jobs. Jonathan's expression softened slightly. Ms. Miller, Grace, I'm not trying to make you uncomfortable, but my daughter's well-being is worth any price. If you can help her, even just by being present, I'd be grateful. Grace looked down at Lily, who chose that moment to look up at her and smile. A brilliant, joyful smile that made Grace's decision for her. Okay, she heard herself say, but on my terms. When I have time, when it feels right. And Lily comes first. If she seems uncomfortable or upset, we stop. Agreed? Agreed. Jonathan pulled out his phone. May I have your number, so we can coordinate schedules? Grace rattled off her number, watching as he typed it in with swift efficiency. Her phone buzzed a moment later with a text. This is Jonathan Hale. Thank you for agreeing to this. I finish here at 4, Grace said. Then I have a shift at the Sterling Room from 6 to close. Tomorrow I have morning classes until noon. Jonathan nodded, processing this information. What if we met for lunch tomorrow after your classes? Somewhere casual, wherever you'd like. Just the 3 of us. Grace thought about her schedule, about the mountain of homework she needed to complete, about the 100 reasons this was a bad idea. Then she looked at Lily again, at those dark eyes watching her with such trust, and found herself agreeing. There's a park near campus. Lincoln Park, by the pond. If the weather's decent, we could meet there. There's a cafe nearby. Perfect. Text me the details? I will. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. An oddly domestic scene. Jonathan with his coffee. Grace with Lily in her lap. The diner humming around them. Grace found herself studying Jonathan when she thought he wasn't looking. There were shadows under his eyes that suggested he didn't sleep well and a tension in his shoulders that never quite released. He was younger than she'd first thought, probably early 40s rather than mid, but he carried himself with the weight of someone who'd lived a much longer life. Can I ask you something? Grace said. Of course. Why is it just you and Lily? Where's her mother? The question hung in the air between them. Grace immediately regretted asking, seeing something flash across Jonathan's face. Pain, quickly masked. I'm sorry, she said quickly. That was too personal. You don't have to answer. No, it's a fair question. Jonathan set down his coffee cup carefully. Lily's mother passed away shortly after giving birth, complications that the doctors couldn't prevent. Oh God, I'm so sorry. It was 2 years ago. Jonathan's voice was steady, but Grace heard the effort it took. I've had time to adjust. But Lily never knew her mother. I've tried to fill that role, to be enough for her, but, he gestured helplessly, I'm not her mother. I can't be. Grace felt tears prick her eyes. She looked down at Lily, who was now drowsing in her arms, worn out from the excitement of the day. You're doing your best. That's all anyone can do. Is it enough, though? Jonathan asked. And for the first time, Grace heard vulnerability in his voice. When she looks at you and calls you Mama, am I supposed to correct her? Tell her you're not her mother? Or do I let her have this moment of comfort, even if it's based on something that isn't real? Grace didn't have an answer. She held Lily closer, feeling the steady rise and fall of the child's breathing. Maybe, she said slowly, we don't have to define it right now. Maybe we just let Lily lead and see where this goes. No pressure, no expectations, just being present for her. Jonathan looked at her with something like relief. That sounds wise. I'm studying social work, Grace admitted, child welfare specifically, so I've learned a lot about attachment and development, at least in theory, though this is definitely a new experience for me in practice. What made you choose that field? Grace hesitated, then decided honesty was the best approach. I lost my parents when I was 7. Car accident. My grandmother took me in, raised me until she passed last year. I remember what it felt like to be a scared kid who'd lost everything. I want to help other children who are going through similar things. I'm sorry for your loss, Jonathan said quietly. Both losses. Thank you. Grace shifted Lily slightly, who murmured in her sleep but didn't wake. My grandmother was amazing. She worked 2 jobs to support us, made sure I stayed in school, always believed I could do something meaningful with my life. Everything I am, I owe to her. She sounds like a remarkable woman. She was. Grace smiled despite the ache in her chest. She would have loved this situation, actually. She was always telling me I needed to be more spontaneous, to let life surprise me sometimes. And is this sufficiently surprising? Jonathan asked, and Grace was startled to see the hint of a smile on his face. Are you kidding? A billionaire showing up at my diner with his daughter who thinks I'm her mother? I'd say this exceeds my surprise quota for the year. Jonathan's smile widened slightly. I'm not a billionaire. Oh, my apologies. Multimillionaire. That's more accurate. They shared a moment of humor, and Grace realized with some surprise that she was enjoying this. Jonathan Hale, stripped of his intimidating reputation and expensive surroundings, was actually pleasant company. There was a sharp intelligence in his eyes, yes, and that ever-present awareness that suggested he was always 3 steps ahead of everyone around him. But there was also a dry wit, and when he looked at his daughter, a tenderness that made Grace's heart hurt in the best way. I should let you get back to work, Jonathan said, checking his watch. And Lily needs her nap. Grace carefully transferred the sleeping child back to her father's arms. Lily stirred, made a small sound of protest but settled against Jonathan's chest with the ease of long practice. Tomorrow then? Jonathan confirmed. Around 12:30? I'll be there. He stood, pulling out his wallet, but Grace stopped him. Coffee's on the house. I can't let... You can and you will. Consider it a goodwill gesture. Grace smiled. Save your money for actual necessities. Like the dozen stuffed animals Lily's probably going to want me to help her pick out at some point. Jonathan laughed. A real laugh this time, surprised out of him. You're probably right about that. Grace walked them to the door, acutely aware of Rosie and her other co-workers watching with undisguised curiosity. At the threshold, Jonathan paused. Thank you, Grace, for giving us a chance. Thank you for trusting me with her. Grace replied, meaning it. She watched through the diner window as Jonathan settled Lily into a car seat in the back of an elegant black car. Not a limousine, but definitely not something Grace could ever afford. He gave her a small wave before climbing in, and then they were gone, leaving Grace standing in the diner doorway wondering what exactly she'd just agreed to. Spill. Now. Rosie appeared at her elbow, arms crossed but eyes twinkling. There's nothing to spill, Grace protested. Honey, that man looked at you like you hung the moon and his daughter clearly adores you. That's not nothing. It's not like that. He just wants me to spend time with Lily because she's been having developmental delays and for some reason responds well to me. Uh-huh. Rosie didn't sound convinced. And the fact that he's gorgeous and clearly interested has nothing to do with anything? He's not interested. He's just concerned about his daughter. If you say so. Rosie patted her arm. But take it from someone who's been around the block a few times. That man didn't track you down at your second job just for his daughter's sake. He wanted to see you again. Grace shook her head, but even as she returned to her tables, she couldn't quite shake Rosie's words. or the memory of how Jonathan had looked at her across the booth, with something in his eyes that went beyond gratitude. That evening at the Sterling Room passed without incident, though Grace found herself constantly glancing at the door, half expecting Jonathan and Lily to appear again. They didn't, but Richard did pull her aside during a slow moment. "Mr. Hale called this afternoon," he said, adjusting his glasses nervously. "He's requested that you be assigned to his table whenever he dines here. He's also arranged to prepay a rather substantial gratuity to ensure your continued availability." Grace felt heat creep up her neck. He did what? It's highly unusual, I admit, but Mr. Hale is an important client, and if he wants to ensure quality service, Richard, I need you to give that money back. Her manager blinked. "Excuse me? I'm not..." Grace struggled to find the right words. "I'm helping with his daughter because I want to, not because he's paying me. If he wants to leave tips for actual service when he dines here, that's fine. But I won't accept money for spending time with Lily outside of work. It feels wrong." Richard looked baffled, as if Grace had started speaking a foreign language. "Most people would be thrilled. I'm not most people," Grace said firmly. "Please call him back and explain. He can request my section when he's here, that's fine, but no prepaid gratuities." Richard shook his head slowly. "You're either very principled or very foolish. Maybe both," Grace admitted with a small smile. Later that night, as Grace rode the bus home through Chicago's darkened streets, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Your manager called. I respect your position, though I think you're being unnecessarily stubborn. I look forward to tomorrow. Jonathan." Grace smiled despite herself and typed back, "Stubbornness is one of my best qualities. See you at 12:30. His response came quickly. "I'm beginning to realize that. Lily says goodnight, by the way. She asked for you before bed." Grace's throat tightened. She stared at the message for a long moment before responding. "Tell her goodnight from me. Sweet dreams, little one." She watched the dots appear and disappear several times, as if Jonathan was writing and deleting responses. Finally, she smiled. "Thank you." Grace put her phone away, looking out at the city lights blurring past the bus window. Her life had been so carefully constructed. School, work, more work, always moving toward a distant goal of stability and success. There wasn't room for complications or surprises or mysterious men with wounded eyes and daughters who called her mama. But maybe, Grace thought, remembering what Rosie had said about life not waiting for you to be ready, maybe some complications were worth it. Maybe some surprises were meant to be embraced. The bus pulled up to her stop and Grace stepped out into the cold November night. Tomorrow she'd meet Jonathan and Lily in the park. Tomorrow she'd take another step into this strange new chapter of her life. She was terrified. She was excited. She was, despite everything sensible that told her to walk away, committed to seeing where this led. Because at the end of the day, there was a little girl who needed something Grace could apparently provide, even if she didn't fully understand what that something was. And there was a man who loved his daughter enough to trust a stranger with her heart. How could Grace possibly say no to that? As she climbed the stairs to her apartment, Grace's phone buzzed one more time. A photo message from Jonathan. Lily, asleep in her bed, clutching a stuffed rabbit, a peaceful smile on her small face. The message attached read, "Thank you for this. For her, Jay." Grace saved the photo, her own smile matching Lily's. "You're welcome," she whispered to the empty hallway. "Both of you." Tomorrow couldn't come fast enough. 3 weeks had passed since that first lunch in Lincoln Park, and Grace's life had transformed in ways she never could have anticipated. What started as occasional meetings had become a regular part of her routine. Tuesday and Thursday afternoons after her classes, Grace would meet Jonathan and Lily at various locations around Chicago. The park, child-friendly cafes, the aquarium on one memorable Saturday. Each time Lily's face would light up with pure joy, and she'd run into Grace's arms calling Mama, with increasing confidence. And each time Grace felt her heart expand a little more to accommodate this unexpected love. She was sitting in her apartment on a cold December morning, surrounded by textbooks and half-finished papers, when her phone rang. Jonathan's name flashed on the screen, and Grace smiled despite her exhaustion. "Good morning," she answered. "Grace," Jonathan's voice sounded strained. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." Grace sat up straighter, her smile fading. "Of course. What's wrong?" There was a pause, filled with the sound of Jonathan's measured breathing. "Did your grandmother ever work at St. Catherine's Hospital?" The question hit Grace like a physical blow. "What? How did you—" "Yes, she did. She was a nurse there for years. Why? Another pause, longer this time. Can we meet? Today, if possible. There's something I need to discuss with you, and I'd rather do it in person. Grace's mind raced. I have class until 11, then I'm free. Jonathan, you're scaring me. What's this about? I'll explain everything when I see you. Can you come to my office? I'll send a car. I can take the bus. Please, Grace, let me send a car. There was something in his voice that made her agree. Okay. Text me the address. 2 hours later, Grace found herself in the back of a luxury sedan, watching Chicago's downtown skyline grow closer. The driver, Marcus, who'd introduced himself with a kind smile, navigated the traffic with practiced ease while Grace tried to calm her racing thoughts. St. Catherine's Hospital. That's where her grandmother had worked for most of her career. Grace had vague memories of visiting her there as a child, the smell of antiseptic and the kind nurses who always had candy for her. But what did that have to do with Jonathan and Lily? The car pulled up to a sleek glass building in the heart of the financial district. Marcus opened her door and guided her through the lobby to a private elevator that required a key card. They rode up in silence, Grace's stomach churning with anxiety. The elevator opened directly into a reception area decorated in understated elegance. A woman at the desk smiled warmly. Ms. Miller, Mr. Hale is expecting you. Right this way. Grace followed her down a hallway lined with abstract art, until they reached a set of double doors. The receptionist knocked once, then opened them. Jonathan's office was enormous, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city. But Grace barely noticed the decor. Her attention was fixed on Jonathan, who stood by the windows looking haggard, as if he hadn't slept in days. Thank you, Patricia, he said to the receptionist, who nodded and left, closing the doors behind her. For a moment, they just looked at each other. Grace had never seen Jonathan like this. His usual composure cracked, revealing something raw and uncertain underneath. Where's Lily? Grace asked. With Marcus's wife, Elena. She helps me with childcare sometimes. Jonathan moved away from the window, gesturing to a seating area with comfortable couches. Please sit down. Grace perched on the edge of a couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Jonathan sat across from her, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. I've been investigating something, he began. Or rather, I had someone investigate. I needed to understand why Lily responded to you the way she did. It seemed too immediate, too certain to be random chance. And Grace's voice came out barely above a whisper. Jonathan pulled out a folder from the coffee table and opened it. Grace saw documents, photos, official-looking papers with hospital letterhead. Your grandmother, Margaret Miller, worked at St. Catherine's Hospital from 1985 until her retirement in 2020. Jonathan's fingers traced over a document. She was the head nurse in the maternity ward for the last 15 years of her career. Grace nodded slowly. Yes, she was very proud of that. She loved working with new mothers and babies. She was there the night Lily was born. Jonathan looked up at her, his dark eyes intense. She was one of the attending nurses during the delivery. Grace's breath caught. What? I had my team pull the hospital records. It took some convincing and some legal maneuvering, but we got them. Your grandmother was present during Lily's birth. She assisted during the complications that, his voice cracked slightly, that took my wife from me. Grace felt the room spin. She gripped the edge of the couch, trying to process this information. I don't understand. Grandma never mentioned, she never said anything about, there's more. Jonathan pulled out another document. 3 days after Lily was born, after my wife had passed, your grandmother requested a private meeting with me at the hospital. I was barely functioning at the time, dealing with funeral arrangements and a newborn I had no idea how to care for. I don't remember much from those days. He handed Grace a piece of paper, a letter, written in careful cursive that Grace recognized instantly as her grandmother's handwriting. Her eyes filled with tears as she read, Mr. Hale, I am writing to express my deepest condolences for your loss. What happened to your wife should never have occurred, and I want you to know that there were irregularities that night that troubled me greatly. I have documented everything and reported my concerns to the hospital administration. Your daughter is beautiful and deserves to know the truth about her mother someday. I hope you will find the strength to be the father she needs. I am retiring at the end of this month. If you ever need to discuss what happened that night, please don't hesitate to contact me. With sympathy, Margaret Miller, RN. Grace looked up at Jonathan, tears streaming down her face. She never told me. In all the years after this, she never mentioned you or Lily or any of it. I never contacted her, Jonathan said quietly. I was drowning in grief and new fatherhood. I pushed away anything that reminded me of that night. By the time I could think clearly again, years had passed. He paused. I think she wanted to protect you. She'd retired by then, and mentioning it would have required explaining things that were probably confidential. What irregularities? Grace asked, her voice shaking. What was she talking about? Jonathan stood and walked back to the windows, his shoulders tense. That's what I'm trying to find out. The hospital administration at the time dismissed her concerns as the trauma response of a nurse who'd witnessed a tragic event. But reading this letter now, with everything that's happened, he turned to face her. Grace, I think your grandmother saw something that night. Something wrong. Grace stood on trembling legs. Are you suggesting that what happened to your wife wasn't natural? I'm saying I don't know. Jonathan's voice was strained. And I need to find out. For Lily's sake, for the truth. Grace crossed to him, stopping a few feet away. Jonathan, this is huge. If there really was something wrong, if someone... She couldn't finish the sentence. I know. He looked at her with eyes full of pain and determination. But here's what I can't stop thinking about. Lily recognized something in you. Something that made her feel safe, made her call you Mama on sight. What if on some level she remembered your grandmother, the woman who was there when she was born, who tried to protect her mother? That's not possible, Grace whispered. She was a newborn. Babies don't retain memories from that age. Consciously, no. But there are studies about cellular memory, about how trauma and comfort can leave impressions that last a lifetime. Jonathan moved closer to her. What if Lily sensed something in you? Maybe a scent, maybe something in how you held her, that reminded her of your grandmother, of someone who tried to help. Grace wrapped her arms around herself. This is too much. I need to think. I know, and I'm sorry to burden you with this, but you deserve to know the truth about your grandmother's involvement. And Jonathan hesitated. There's something else. Someone's been watching us. Grace's blood ran cold. What? I've noticed the same car following us several times over the past week. Different drivers, but the same vehicle. Someone is interested in my connection to you, which means they might be interested in what your grandmother knew. You think I'm in danger? Grace's voice came out higher than she intended. I think we all might be. Jonathan stepped closer, close enough that Grace could see the worry etched into his features. I've increased security. Marcus has been keeping an eye on you, though you probably haven't noticed. I won't let anyone hurt you, Grace, I promise. Grace looked up at him. This man who'd entered her life so unexpectedly and turned everything upside down. Why are you telling me all this? You could have just sent me away, kept me out of whatever this is. Because you're already part of it, Jonathan said simply. And because... He stopped, seeming to wrestle with something internal. Because over these past weeks you've become important to us. To Lily, yes, but also to me. I can't imagine our lives without you in them anymore. Grace's heart hammered in her chest. The air between them felt charged, heavy with unspoken feelings. She'd been trying so hard not to acknowledge her growing feelings for Jonathan, telling herself it was just about Lily, just about helping a child in need. But that was a lie, and they both knew it. I care about you too, Grace admitted quietly. Both of you. More than I should probably. Jonathan reached out slowly, giving her time to step away if she wanted. When she didn't move, he gently cupped her face in his hands. There's no should in how we feel, only what is. This is complicated, Grace breathed. Everything worth having is complicated. He leaned down slowly, his eyes searching hers for permission. Grace rose on her toes to meet him halfway, and their lips met in a kiss that felt like coming home and jumping off a cliff all at once. It was tender and desperate, sweet and intense. Grace's hands gripped his shoulders while his arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her close. In that moment, all the fear and confusion fell away, leaving only the certainty of this connection between them. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Jonathan rested his forehead against hers. We'll figure this out, he said softly. Whatever happened to my wife, whatever your grandmother knew, whoever's watching us, we'll face it together. Together, Grace echoed, the word feeling like a promise. A knock on the door made them step apart. Patricia's voice came through. Mr. Hale, I'm sorry to interrupt, but Marcus just called. He says it's urgent. Jonathan's expression immediately shifted to alert concern. He crossed to his desk and picked up the phone. Marcus? Grace watched as his face drained of color. When? Is she okay? I'm on my way. 5 minutes. He hung up and looked at Grace. Someone tried to approach Lily at the park. Marcus intervened before anything happened, but his voice was tight with barely controlled fear. We need to go. Now. They rushed to the elevator, Grace's mind reeling. This was real. The danger wasn't theoretical anymore. Someone was actually targeting them. In the car, speeding through Chicago traffic, Jonathan held Grace's hand tightly. I'm moving Lily to a safe location. Somewhere secure where I know she'll be protected. Where? Grace asked. My family has a property outside the city. Private, gated, with full security. I'm taking her there tonight. He looked at Grace. I want you to come with us. Jonathan, I have classes, work. I know what I'm asking. But Grace, if someone is connecting you to this, to whatever your grandmother knew, then you might not be safe either. His grip on her hand tightened. Please, at least for a few days, until I can figure out what's happening and neutralize the threat. Grace thought about her tiny apartment, her routine life, her carefully laid plans. Then she thought about Lily's smile, about the little girl who'd claimed her as mama, about Jonathan's arms around her and the promise of together. Okay, she said. I'll come with you. Relief flooded Jonathan's features. Thank you. They arrived at the park to find Marcus standing protectively near a bench where Elena sat with Lily. The little girl looked shaken but unharmed, clutching her stuffed rabbit tightly. The moment Lily saw Grace, she burst into tears and reached for her. Mama! Mama, scared! Grace gathered her up, holding her tight while Lily sobbed against her shoulder. It's okay, sweet girl. I've got you. You're safe. Over Lily's head, Grace met Jonathan's eyes. She saw the determination there, the fierce protectiveness of a father who would do anything to keep his daughter safe, and she knew that whatever came next, whatever truths they uncovered about the past, they would face it together. For Lily, for each other, for the family they were becoming. Against all odds and in the face of danger neither of them yet fully understood. The truth was coming, ready or not. And with it the chance for justice, healing, and a future none of them could have predicted. The Hale family estate sat 40 miles outside Chicago, surrounded by snow-dusted trees and protected by gates that looked more appropriate for a fortress than a home. Grace pressed her face to the window as their car wound up the driveway, taking in the sprawling property that would be their sanctuary. It's beautiful, she whispered. Jonathan, holding a sleeping Lily, managed a small smile. My grandfather built it in the 1950s. I grew up spending summers here. A woman in her 60s with kind eyes and silver hair waited at the entrance. Jonathan, sweetheart, she said warmly. It's been too long. Catherine, this is Grace Miller. Grace. Catherine Walsh has managed this property for 30 years. Catherine's knowing gaze shifted to Grace. So this is the young woman we've been hearing about. It's a pleasure, dear. Inside, the house felt like a real home. Hardwood floors, comfortable furniture, family photos spanning generations. Catherine showed them to their rooms, placing Grace next to the nursery where Lily would sleep. That night, after settling Lily into bed, Jonathan found Grace in her room. I wanted to make sure you had everything you need. I'm fine. This room is beautiful. He sat in the armchair by the window, looking uncertain. Grace, I'm sorry for dragging you into this situation. You didn't drag me anywhere. I chose to come. Grace moved closer. I trust you, and whatever this is between us, I want to see where it goes. Jonathan's expression softened. When this started, I told myself it was just about Lily. But that was a lie I stopped believing weeks ago. When did you know? Grace asked quietly. That day at the aquarium, watching you and Lily looking at the beluga whales. You looked back at me and smiled, and I thought, this is what our life could be like. The three of us together. Grace felt tears prick her eyes. I knew at the park, the second time we met. Lily fell asleep in my arms and I realized I wanted to be part of your future. Jonathan knelt beside her chair. Grace, I need you to understand what being with me means. My life isn't normal. There are parts of my business that exist in gray areas. I have people who would use anyone I care about against me. Are you trying to talk me out of this? I'm trying to be honest. You deserve someone whose life is simple. Grace touched his face. Jonathan Hale. I work 3 jobs while going to school. My life has never been simple. I don't want simple. I want real. And this is the most real thing I've felt in years. He kissed her then, soft and full of promise. We'll figure this out. Together. Over the next 3 days they lived in a strange bubble, Grace helping with cooking, playing with Lily in the snow, spending evenings with Jonathan, growing closer with every shared moment. On the 4th day, Marcus arrived with news. 3 nurses from St. Catherine's Hospital had agreed to meet, the ones who'd been on duty the night Lily was born. At a small suburban cafe, The women looked nervous, but determined. Patricia, the first to speak, said, "We've kept quiet for 2 years because we were scared. But when we learned it was Margaret Miller's granddaughter asking, 'Your grandmother tried to do the right thing. What happened that night?'" Jonathan's voice was strained. Janet pulled out a worn notebook. "I kept notes. Caroline Hale's delivery was progressing normally. Then Dr. Stevens administered something unusual. Margaret questioned it, but she was overruled. Within 20 minutes, Caroline started showing signs of severe distress. Margaret was certain it was a reaction to whatever Dr. Stevens had given her." Patricia continued. "But Margaret saved Lily. She took her the moment she was delivered, got her to the neonatal team while we tried to save Caroline." Jonathan's face had gone pale. Why would anyone do this? Patricia and Janet exchanged glances. There were rumors that Dr. Stevens had serious financial troubles, and that someone offered to clear them in exchange for... She couldn't finish. Grace gripped Jonathan's hand under the table as understanding washed over them both. Marcus asked, "Do you have any proof?" "The hospital records were altered. Margaret tried to keep copies, but they disappeared. We only have our memories and these notes." In the car afterward, Jonathan's composure shattered. "Someone paid to have Caroline eliminated, and I never knew. For 2 years I thought it was just tragedy." Grace held him while his shoulders shook. "We know now, and we'll find out who did this." Marcus cleared his throat. "Boss, our investigator found something. A business deal that went bad 6 months before Lily was born. The Riverside Project. Caroline's family company was the primary developer. When it failed, several investors lost millions." Jonathan looked up. "But Caroline wasn't directly involved." "No, but she was the heir. If something happened to her before she could inherit, the assets would have been liquidated. The investors could have recouped their losses." Grace felt cold. "Someone harmed her for money? People have done worse for less," Marcus said grimly. The confrontation came 3 days later. Grace was in the garden with Lily when a black SUV crashed through the estate gates. Marcus immediately positioned himself protectively as 3 men emerged. "We're not here to cause trouble," one said, hands raised. "We need to talk to Mr. Hale. It's about his wife." Jonathan appeared, his face a mask of controlled fury. "You have 30 seconds to explain." "My name is Richard Thornton. I was an investor in the Riverside Project. I think we need to talk about what really happened to Caroline Hale. I have information about who ordered it." After tense negotiations, Thornton came inside with his lawyers. Catherine took Grace and Lily upstairs while the men talked. 2 hours passed before Marcus came to get Grace. In the study, Jonathan looked like he'd aged a decade. "It was Victor Reeves," Jonathan said hollowly. "Caroline's own godfather. He lost nearly everything in the Riverside Project. He paid Dr. Stevens $500,000 to ensure Caroline didn't survive the delivery. Do you have proof?" Thornton brought everything. Financial records, recorded conversations, documentation. "My lawyers believe it's enough." Jonathan looked up, tears streaming down his face. "We got him, Grace. The man who took Caroline from us." Grace knelt beside him. "Your grandmother would be proud." Jonathan pulled back to look at her. "I love you, Grace Miller. I should have said it before now. I love you for your strength, your refusal to walk away when things got difficult. I love you too. You and Lily. You're my family now. Then make it official." Jonathan opened a small box, revealing a simple, elegant ring. "Grace Elizabeth Miller, will you marry me? Will you be my wife and Lily's mother?" "Yes." Grace laughed through tears. "Yes to all of it. Mama, Daddy." Lily appeared in the doorway, having escaped Catherine. She looked between them, then smiled brilliantly. "Mama, stay." Grace knelt and opened her arms. "Mama's staying forever, sweet girl." Lily ran into her embrace, then pulled Jonathan into their hug. The 3 of them stayed like that, a family forged by choice and love and courage. 6 months later, the small wedding took place in the estate's garden on a perfect June morning. Grace wore a simple white dress. Lily, in purple, scattered rose petals with intense concentration. As Jonathan slipped the wedding band onto Grace's finger, she thought about the incredible journey that had brought them here. Victor Reeves awaited trial. Her grandmother's name had been cleared. They had everything. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the officiant said. "You may kiss your bride." Jonathan cupped Grace's face. "Hello, Mrs. Hale." "Hello, Mr. Hale," Grace whispered back. Their kiss was sweet and full of promise. As they walked down the aisle with Lily between them, Grace caught sight of a framed photo, her grandmother in her nursing uniform, eyes twinkling with wisdom. "Thank you, Grandma." Later, As the sun set, Jonathan found Grace by the garden's edge. "Penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Hale. Just thinking about how much has changed since that November night when Lily said her first word. Do you regret any of it?" Grace turned in his arms. "I don't regret a single moment. This life is big and complicated and sometimes scary, but it's also full of love and purpose and joy. I wouldn't trade it for anything." "Mama! Daddy, come see." Lily pointed at the first stars appearing. They stood on either side of their daughter, each taking one small hand. "Make wish," Lily said, closing her eyes. Grace looked at Jonathan over Lily's head and saw her own contentment reflected in his expression. What more could they wish for? They had each other. They had the truth. They had justice. They had a future full of possibility. They had everything. Sometimes the best stories don't follow the script you write for yourself. Sometimes they're written by a 2-year-old who points at a stranger and says, "Mama." Sometimes they're written by love that finds you when you least expect it. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, those stories have happy endings. This was theirs.